launch at just the right time so their old friend the moon comes along to pull us in. We don't need to pay for that. The energy's already been deposited. How do we slow down? We say, thank you, God, for giving us an atmosphere. It's something to breathe. And if I get the angle right, I can use it to slow me down without using any propeller. Remember Apollo 13? You had to get the angle right, or you dig a hole in the ground, or you say bye-bye Earth. So, dear Dr. Campbell demonstrated thoroughly that you shouldn't listen to astronomers when they talk about flight because it's something about which they know nothing. That's the theme there. Now, another man who had to put up with ridicule, this is Billy Mitchell, an American hero. Now, fought in the First World War, was a pilot, said afterward that aerial stuff has changed warfare entirely. We'll be sinking ships from the air. The Secretary of the Navy said, I'll stand on board any ship he thinks he can sink from the air. That's ridiculous. He was court-martialed for opening his mouth when he shouldn't. And the real irony, on November 29th, 1941, there was the Army-Navy football game. Think of it. And the program had a picture of the USS Arizona, monstrous battleship. And there was a line in the program that said, nobody has ever sunk a battleship from the air. 8 days later at Pearl Harbor, a Japanese plane sunk the USS Arizona, killing 1,100 men who were on board. Not having imagination, not doing their homework, cost a lot of lives. Billy was outspoken, but he was a hero. There's Robert Goddard. Wrote a lot of articles. He was a professor at Clark University. Clark College, I guess it was then. The New York Times, in like 1919, wrote a very disparaging article about him because he had mentioned in a paper he did the possibility of space flight. And the New York Times said, here's Dr. Clark with a seat, Dr. Goddard with a seat at Clark. Doesn't even know what every high school student knows, that when you're in a vacuum, there's nothing for the exhaust to react against from a rocket. The funny thing is, they did correct that article because the exhaust reacts against the rocket, not against the atmosphere. They corrected that article when the Apollo command module was on its way to the moon in July 1969. They regret the mistake. He had to go do his work at, among other places, Roswell, New Mexico. They didn't mind his firing rockets out in the boonies, so who's to mind? There's nobody there, you know. And Goddard's estate got $1 million about 1960. He died in the 40s because the government used his patents on rocketry without bothering to get permission or anything else like that. That was a New York Times that said that. Another American hero. There's Werner von Braun. He was our German, not the Russians' German. Now, to illustrate, he's the guy responsible for us landing on the moon. One of his people came up with a bright idea. The original plan was to have 2 Saturn V rockets launched, rendezvous, and send something off to the moon. They go together. And one guy figured out, we could get by with one if we take off from Earth orbit instead of lunar orbit. Did the calculations, that's how they decided to do it. We got by with 1 instead of 2 Saturn V launches. It's not just the cost, but the launch pads and the weather and all the other stuff that needs to be taken into account. Von Braun had vision. He had guts. The United States had a goal, thanks to John F. Kennedy. Do you realize NASA hasn't had a goal since that time? Keep the funding coming, that's their goal. When I was in the space program, I thought we'd for sure have a base on the moon by now and have gone to Mars. But they didn't have a goal. Two scientists, Pons and Fleischmann, they announced cold fusion. And boy, did they get torn to ribbons by the scientific community. There's a whole chapter in the book about this. And there's still work going on, sponsored by respectable outfits like Toyota, like the Electric Power Research Institute, and a number of others. Yeah, the first experiments weren't great. You'd be surprised how many people have found the same effect when they modified what they were doing. I anticipate we're going to have some free energy from cold fusion. It isn't free. Free energy from the sun isn't free either. You got to pay for the converter. The lucky old sun doesn't collect any dough, but the guy who makes the equipment does. But these guys were maligned. People couldn't get funding to try to do more research. Now, one of the chapters in the book, this guy's one of my heroes, Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. He was a doctor who was horrified at the fact that in the hospital he worked delivering babies way back in the 1800s, early 1800s, the midwife section of deliverers, only a couple percent, 2 or 3% got childbed fever. Where the doctors were, 20% did, and this was invariably fatal. Semmelweis figured out, and the story is told in the book. Kathleen Marden wrote this chapter and did a splendid job on it. He did get honored, but he figured out, it took a while, he figured out that it was the fact that they weren't washing their hands. They'd go from doing autopsies with dead women, come right on down and deliver babies after examining several other women, and 20% wound up with childbed fever. He set up special regulations, washing your hands, doing all kinds of good things. They even changed the sheets more than once a month. The doctor who headed the hospital couldn't stand his authority being usurped and forced Semmelweis out. He did good research, he published papers, but we're not going to go for this nonsense. How many women died because the authority figure had spoken? He had guts. And they did honor him with this postage stamp 100 years after his birth. I really don't even want to talk about this guy, the father of the eugenics movement in the United States. As somebody whose grandparents all came from Eastern Europe, they would have been rejected by this guy. They couldn't pass an English language IQ test. They didn't speak English. Any family with a defective person, deaf, blind, whatever, they wanted to sterilize the women in the family. There's a long, sad chapter. The Nazis took this to the nth degree. But this had full support from some of America's wealthiest people. There were even laws passed okaying sterilization on the flimsiest of excuses. It's a sad chapter. We blame the Nazis. They got it from us. Eugenics. Put an asterisk after that word. Now we'll get to the UFOs. One of the biggest objections is there is no evidence. This comes from the people who haven't studied any evidence. They don't know about it. It doesn't exist. There isn't any evidence. Astronomers, the SETI specialists. You've all heard of SETI, S-E-T-I, silly effort to investigate. Based on a whole bunch of really strange assumptions. There are aliens out there using equipment that's compatible with our equipment to send signals to us. And if we don't get a signal, they ain't coming.